For me, I was thinking about the new restrictions that came in on Monday, and that triggered me to realize I hadn't updated my license yet, the address on my license, since we moved about 3 months ago. And I was wrestling with what if I, exercise with someone who's just across the boundary into an area of concern, and I'm asked by the police, where do I live? I pull out my license. Do I tell them about my actual address, or do I just, stay quiet because that address happens to fall in the area of concern? Or there was situations in our house this week. One of them, the question was asked to the children, have you brushed your teeth? And one child says, yep, I've done all my routines. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to do some fun activity. And then we discover evidence to the contrary in our house, and the lie is exposed. We responded by giving an appropriate consequence, and it was to match there being a bit of a pattern developing, a pattern of deceit. And then on TV, we watched an episode of The Good Doctor this week, and a lead character, Sean Murphy, he's lost his focus before his first lead surgery. He's in his third year of residency in hospital, and he's got autism. And so fellow resident Dr. Brown, she lies to Dr. Murphy, telling him what he'd love to hear to kind of set his fears at ease and help him to focus on the surgery. It's okay, Sean. I chatted with Carly and it's all good. Yeah, I wonder where you kind of engage with those kind of incidences in your life. Well, today we're resuming the Proverbs series. And the reality is that the Proverbs helps us to see that these moments matter. Now, many of you will have engaged with the series earlier in the year, back in January. And if you haven't and you want to dip into that, it's available on the Joshua Tree podcast. But a key kind of idea running through this series and running through the book of Proverbs is this idea of a crossroads, and there being crossroad moments where the option is presented to us of choosing wisdom or folly, choosing life or death. And in chapters 8 and 9, we kind of get these characters personified, Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly, and they're calling for our attention, calling out. And we've got this tension as to who we'll listen to. And a couple of years ago in family devotions in our house, Haley and I actually acted this out to try and make it a bit vivid and engaging for the kids. And so Haley played Woman Wisdom, and she was kind of trying to woo and persuade the kids to listen to her. I played Woman Folly, and the kids were trying to discern, who's actually on about something good here, whose attention am I going to give my heart to. And I used a quote at the start of the series from Ed Welch, which I thought was just really helpful in capturing this dynamic. I'm going to read that again now. It says, when we read through Proverbs, we notice that we are always standing at a crossroads, with wisdom pointing us to the kingdom of heaven and folly trying to seduce us away from it. At that decision point, which we encounter all the time, we must be wide awake, all of our wits about us, because our natural instinct is to veer onto the path of folly. When seen from a distance, folly looks like, well, folly. After all, who would tease an asp or walk randomly around an area loaded with traps and snares? But when temptation is breathing down our necks, it can suddenly appear rational, attractive, and satisfying. One goal of the book of Proverbs is to prepare us for that crossroads moment by helping us step back, get a little distance. So what's this kind of idea of a crossroad moment all based on? Well, under everything is really the fear of the Lord, which we're introduced to in Proverbs 1, verse 7. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. But what is the fear of the Lord? Well, it's really recognizing that God is God and I am not. I'm a creature before my Creator. I was made by God and exist for God, and it's not the other way around. He's not there for me to kind of mould into my image, but I'm to be moulded into His image. And there's also this sense in which we rejoice and we tremble. You see, God has no equal, and that means He's beautiful, and so we're drawn to Him. But there's something that's also a bit terrifying, because He has ultimate power. We're drawn to both His goodness, but we stand in awe of the authority that he has in his world. And I wonder if you noticed in that verse that I read, 1 verse 7, the sense of the crossroads even there. I forgot to put this in the slides, but there's these two alternative paths laid out, a fork in the road and the need to choose carefully. You see, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's path one: knowledge, understanding, wisdom, life. But what else? What's the alternative? But fools despise wisdom and instruction. It's to turn the other way. It's to turn away. And so Proverbs opens up these paths for us, and it gives us eyes to see. What is Proverbs? Well, in one sense, it's a father speaking persuasively to a son. It's a parent who has lived and learnt firsthand, a parent whose eyes have been opened to the crossroads, a parent who wants to lovingly instruct, to warn and persuade. It's a parent who does whatever they can to capture their child's attention, to prepare them for what's ahead, to highlight what's at stake, to give sight. How? Ledwell says that Proverbs are vivid and visual, and that's just stuck with me because it captures, I think, a key dynamic of what's going on in Proverbs. It's capturing these sayings in concise, pithy ways, and it's using picture language that captures our hearts. So a son is warned from a woman who's out to seduce. The one who follows her smooth talk is like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierces his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing that it will cost him his life. But Proverbs are also like a boiled lolly. So in our wisdom literature class at SMBC, Kirk Paxton, he gave us hard-boiled lollies out. He passed them out to everyone in the class as a bit of an object lesson. And he's wanting us to really realise that Proverbs are not things that you read once and then kind of move on from. But they're things that you're to turn over and over in your mouth like a lolly. They're things that you're to dwell on, to reflect on, to meditate, so that we can draw out their meaning. And I said earlier in the year that it's helpful to keep in mind that Proverbs are typically true and they're ultimately true. So typically true, not true in every situation with everything that we observe. They don't always work out like that. So sometimes the wicked do prosper, and we see that. But there is also a time when they will be judged, and ultimately their prospering will come to an end. So early in the year, we looked at the detail of chapters 1 to 3 as representative of chapters 1 to 9 in the book of Proverbs. And I really understand chapters 1 to 9 to set a foundation for the kind of collection of sayings that follow in chapters 10 to 13. They seem a bit more random, and you get a whole bunch of themes coming together rather than some more extended discourses that we find earlier. And so what we're doing today, we're zooming in on a theme, and we're looking at truth and lies. And so we're looking at what the whole of Proverbs has to say on this theme. But we're doing it based on what we already know from chapters 1 to 9. Looking at this practical wisdom of Proverbs that's around skill for daily living. But it's not just any old common sense wisdom. It's wisdom that is God-centered. It's shaped around fearing him, and it's designed to show us the difference between wisdom and folly, life and death. Perhaps you're asking, how do you study a theme in Proverbs? Well, kind of the method is collating all it has to say on a topic. And some of the time I spent this week, I was riding the exercise bike and had my Bible open, and I was came up with a bit of a system of notation, but I was just marking all the related proverbs that related to this topic. And it's not just explicitly looking for the words where truth and lies come up, but it's looking for concepts. So where there's deceit, where there's deception, that's also part of the category, right? So you put them together and you ask, what do they say? Are there some common threads or categories that we can group these proverbs together in? And so what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks is to explore 2 to 3 of these categories related to the chosen theme for the week. And by their very nature, we won't be able to say everything that Proverbs has to say on the topic. There'll be more. It's kind of selective. It will be some of the themes, some of those common threads, but not all of them. Now, so I opened with some examples this morning of truth and lies, and perhaps you have some of your own that have come up in the week in whatever sphere you've been engaging. And I wonder, what does Proverbs have to say specifically to those situations? Well, the reading that I put out for the week was chapter 8 of Proverbs, and there are some key verses in that chapter 8 which I think orient us a bit to the start of looking at truth and lies. Particularly in verses 6 to 9, chapter 8, verses 6 to 9. But we'll start by looking at chapter 8, verse 1. Listen to the voice of wisdom in verse 1. Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? And we see in verses 4 to 5 that wisdom is holding out an offer. To you, O people, I call out. I raise my voice to all mankind. To you who are simple, gain prudence. You who are foolish, set your hearts on it. And then we see the trustworthiness of wisdom in verse 6. Listen, for I have trustworthy things to say. I open my lips to speak what is right. And then we meet a contrast in verse 7. My mouth speaks what is true, for my lips detest wickedness. And it's worth pausing at this point and seeing kind of the trajectory of wisdom. As we grow in wisdom, we start to learn to speak truth, to love truth, where truth becomes sweet to us. But at the same time, we're going to see that we're going to develop a distaste, a hatred even, for speaking in a wicked way. So this means something for how we're thinking about honesty versus falsehood and deception and covering up. In verse 8, we see another contrast. All the words of my mouth are just. None of them is crooked or perverse. And in verse 9, there's going to be a division. To the discerning, all of them are right. They are upright to those who have found knowledge. So wise words, true words, just words, they're actually not going to be appreciated by everyone. But there's going to be the discerning, those to whom they seem upright, they sound right. Those with knowledge will value them. So this implies that there'll be those who won't. So that's a bit of an orientation to what Proverbs has to say about truth and lies. What are some of the ways we can kind of put them together, those threads or categories that I mentioned? Well, here are three of them. 1, revealing the heart. So truth and lies show what kind of person you are. Truth shows one to be wise and lies show one to be a fool. Secondly, reality. Truth conforms to reality, while lies twist reality. And then thirdly, you reap what you sow. Truth and lies reap very different consequences. So we're going to look at those three categories during our time together this morning. So revealing the heart, I said truth shows one to be wise and lies show one to be a fool. And we read in chapter 26, Proverbs verse 24, enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their hearts they harbour deceit. See, deception, covering up, actually expresses what's in the heart. And this is anchored in Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. But take a look for what follows in that next verse, 24. Keep your mouth free of perversity. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. So putting these two verses together, if you have a problem with corrupt talk, then the problem runs deeper than your lips. It's anchored in your heart. And we notice this interesting contrast that Proverbs 10 verse 20 makes. Read it with me, 10 verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, but the heart of the wicked is of little value. Do you notice how the tongue of the righteous is kind of put as the opposite to the heart of the wicked? I think that shows, it's almost like they're interchangeable because of the relationship between the tongue and the heart. The tongue of the righteous can be contrasted with the heart of the wicked. And the righteous is just another way of speaking about the wise, and the wicked, another way of speaking of the fool. And we see really clearly that there's a connection between wise speech and a wise person. So Proverbs 16:23, the hearts of the wise make their mouths prudent, and their lips promote instruction. So when you and I speak true, honest, trustworthy words, we're showing something of our hearts, what kind of people we are. But when we find ourselves lying or fudging the truth, we're also showing what kind of people we are. And now perhaps at this point you're hearing similarities with someone else whose teaching we're familiar with. I just want to kind of show you how Jesus' teaching is really getting at the same reality. Here are a couple of things that Jesus said. So Matthew 12:34-35, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. And then again in Matthew 5:18-19, but the thing that comes out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person. Well, what are we to do at this point? I think it's important that we're alert to the way that we speak. And if dishonesty at some points in our life is attractive to us, and we're finding ourselves wanting to avoid the truth, that ought to be a red flag. And I think what we need to think from there, after identifying that flag, is something's going wrong in our hearts and we need help. In that moment, choosing falsehood is folly, and it's to move in the direction of being a foolish person. But conversely, each word of truth is shaping who we are, who we're becoming. That we're growing in wisdom, developing wise hearts when we choose to be honest. How about processing something that's happened, an event afterwards? Well, when Heath was young, I think I've shared this to some of you before, I told a white lie to a friend who'd given Heath a birthday present when he was quite young. It was a book. And his friend came round for dinner, and really Heath hadn't really engaged with it yet. But I found myself saying, oh yeah, Heath loves that book you gave him. It just felt like an automatic response for me. But what did I learn afterwards in processing what happened then? Well, that white lie that I told, it actually showed my foolishness. But it also revealed a heart that wanted to please other people more than the Lord. And as you process moments where you've been dishonest, it's worth asking, is there something that you value too much? Our lies are clues to the disordered loves of our heart. Well, moving on to the second category, reality. Truth conforms to reality, lies twist reality. As you read Proverbs, there are these strings of sayings that relate to witnesses, the courtroom kind of scene, and they contrast truth with lies and different types of witnesses. And Proverbs 12:17 puts it plainly. An honest witness tells the truth, but a false witness tells lies. So a witness who is honest, they tell what really happened. A dishonest witness tells what is false, a distortion of reality. One is transparent, honest, but the other involves deception, are pulling the wool over our eyes. We read again in Proverbs 15:5, an honest witness does not deceive, but a false witness pours out lies. But before we leave the courtroom, we're called to discern the truth, and it's not always what we first think. So Proverbs 18:17, in a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right until someone comes forward and cross-examines. So So this twisting of the truth is what's involved in a falsehood, a distortion of reality. But to distort reality, Proverbs goes even further, is actually equal to an attack. So read Proverbs 25:18. Like a club or a sword or a sharp arrow is one who gives false testimony against a neighbour. Or to put it even more vividly, Proverbs 26:18-19. Like a maniac shooting flaming arrows of death is one who deceives their neighbour and says, I was only joking. What's going on with deception? Well, it's a pretense, it's a disguise, it's a covering over of what really happened, of reality. And so, again, have a look in Proverbs 26:24-26. Enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their hearts they harbour deceit. Though their speech is charming, do not believe them, for 7 abominations fill their hearts. Their malice may be concealed with deception, but their wickedness will be exposed in the assembly. So here a liar might not look like a liar. They may be using smooth talk, telling us what we want to hear. But underneath is something different. This proverb tells us that they're actually an enemy behaving in this way. They're setting themselves against us. And for a time being, we may not see the heart beneath. But this proverb assures us that there will be a time coming when that will be exposed and shown for what it is. So Proverbs also addresses deception through weights and scales and using dishonest kind of business practices. And we see examples of dishonest bartering for selfish gain as well as kind of potential motives behind distorting reality. But we also see kind of something of the impact of this distortion of reality. We see that it causes damage. So look at Proverbs 26:28. A lying tongue hates those it hurts, and a flattering mouth works ruin. Now, to lie to someone, it's actually to hate them. It's to hurt them, and to flatter, whatever the agenda might be, it's to work ruin. So I think of gaslighting. It's come to be a bit of a prominent thing since the prominence of Donald Trump. It's talked about in the media. It kind of stems, if you haven't heard of it before, stems from a film called Gaslight, where a husband is trying to convince his wife that she's mad, and at night he turns gaslights on, he causes them to flicker, but then denies that it's happening, and she starts to question her perception of reality. And there's a lot being written about the damage of gaslighting. It's a form of abuse. So, in a marriage, a wife might say, honey, I feel like you're shirking responsibility with the kids. But that's met with utter denial, and it's actually a really firm stance that's designed to undermine the wife. No? Are you sure you're seeing things right? And over time, this just leads to real damage. That's an example of how this kind of distortion of reality, that the form that it can take. But there's also that extended example of the seducer in chapter 7. And her words are summarized this way, chapter 7:21. With persuasive words, she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. It's a distorted picture of reality. It's put in such an appealing way, but what's at stake for the man seduced? Well, 7:22-23. All at once he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierces his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. But there is an opposite, and it's living honestly. It's helping one another to see reality as it actually is, even if that means having at times to hear things that are uncomfortable. So Proverbs 27:5. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. I wonder, where in your life are you tempted to twist reality? Well, I shared before of my own fear of man, this pressure that I often have given into to want others to think well of me. But another example that was kind of opened up to me through that marriage counselling class that I did was the subtle manipulation of what's called a double bind. And that's where, one person is acting upset. Their body language makes it clear that they're disgruntled and they're unhappy. And the partner asks them, are you okay? And, they push them away. They say, I'm fine. It's okay. There's nothing wrong. And it kind of leaves the other person in an impossible situation. There's no way for them to they suspect something's up, but the other person keeps denying it. And it puts them in an impossible situation. And it may be that as the person kind of creating the double bind, there's a lack of safety maybe. There's a control element. I'm not going to make myself vulnerable to you. Perhaps an attitude of, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to put you in this hard situation and watch you squirm. But there are other ways that we can twist reality as well. We can cover up reality when we struggle to own our wrong against others. And as you'd be familiar with, if you've been chatting with Pierre about forgiveness, there's an important relationship between truth and forgiveness. And so when others wrong us or we wrong others, the person at fault taking responsibility for that wrong is a critical step. And the beauty of knowing Jesus is that we don't have to pretend. We don't have to protect our self-image. We don't have to distort or twist reality. David said, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one in whose spirit is no deceit." Forgiveness in Jesus, it frees us from having to twist reality and to defend ourselves when we've wronged someone else. Instead, we can step out into the light with courage and say, "Yep, I did that. I'm really sorry. Will you forgive me?" So we've seen that deception harms others, and actually it can compound a wrong. It can make it worse if that's your response to something done. But Jesus frees us from having to cover up before God and before others. That brings us to our third category. You reap what you sow. And actually you see that this comes up again and again in Proverbs, pretty much with every theme it addresses. And Proverbs opens our eyes to the starkly different outcomes of truth-telling versus lies. So listen to the end of the deceitful person in Proverbs 6, verses 12 to 15. A troublemaker and a villain who goes about with a corrupt mouth, who winks maliciously with his eye, signals with his feet and motions with his fingers, who plots evil with deceit in his heart. He always stirs up conflict. Therefore, disaster will overtake him in an instant. He will suddenly be destroyed without remedy. There's a natural law of cause and effect that God has built into the fabric of creation. And my dad, in his later years, just before he retired, he had the experience of working under a narcissistic school principal. And he observed him getting caught out in his lies. And there was a sense in which a lie might have been exposed, and so he'd respond by covering up that lie with another lie. And the result of all of that was just this huge growing distrust amongst the other staff in the school. And I think this experience is a reality that Proverbs is addressing. So Proverbs 12:13, evildoers are trapped by their sinful talk, and so the innocent escape trouble. I think my dad's principle, well, he was trapped by his sinful talk. It got him in a real bind. But I think that example also illustrates something else that Proverbs teaches. Proverbs 13, verse 5. The righteous hate what is false, but the wicked make themselves a stench and bring shame on themselves. So over time, that school principal, he really did become a stench. He made many enemies and few friends, and hardly anyone could handle his shameless self-promotion. It's just so off-putting, so disgusting. And this reaping what you sow, it actually reflects God's values. So Proverbs 12:22, the Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. Well, what about the harvest of those who speak truth? What's the positive outcome? Well, Proverbs 12:18-19, the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment. So there's a sense in which wise words, truthful words, honest words, they actually accomplish good ends. They bring things like healing. And elsewhere we see of wise words, we see that they're life-giving. They're described as a tree of life in Proverbs. And truthful lips endure forever. They're actually going to last beyond the here and now. But there's also joy now for the righteous. So Proverbs 12:20, deceit is in the heart of those who plot evil, but those who promote peace have joy. Now, to be deceptive, that's to be the opposite of peaceful. It's actually to create distance in a relationship instead of closeness. And so there's a sense in which to speak honestly, it actually brings people together. There's a oneness, a unity that's created, a closeness. So the way that we speak now, whether truthful or deceptive, it sets in motion a harvest of very different consequences. Now, sure, sometimes people do lie and get away with it, and maybe you've seen that in numerous instances. We might not see shame come upon some liars in this life, or a deceitful person being overtaken immediately by disaster. Perhaps they enjoy luxury for an extended period. But remember, Proverbs is typically true, but also ultimately true. And nothing has escaped God's sight. And I wonder, what outcome do you want for your words? Do you want to speak in ways that last, ways that heal, ways that give life, ways that promote peace and result in joy? Or do you want to cover up? Do you want to sweet talk? Do you want to harm others with your words and eventually cause your own undoing? Well, I just want to make a few connections with the New Testament, with this theme of truth and lies, just to bring a few things together, and then just to suggest a final couple of thoughts in application. I think it's worth saying that Jesus embodies truth. He speaks of himself as the way, the truth, and the life. And John introduces us in his gospel to Jesus, the one who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And we see later in John chapter 8 that Jesus takes a stand against Satan. He says of the devil, he was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So all these things in Proverbs, they're true, but do you see the further connection the New Testament makes to lying, to distorting reality, and to Satan? You know, his purposes are to destroy God's people and to stand against all that God stands for. But Jesus, on the other hand, he embodies truth. And as we grow in his likeness, our words are to reflect reality more and more. And it's interesting that against the backdrop of deceptive teaching and deceptive people, we're called in Ephesians 4, verse 15. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we'll grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. So Jesus does this perfectly. Truth and love come together perfectly in him. So we look at how he relates in the Gospels and we're seeing truth and love coming together. And part of being made new in Christ, it's to grow in that same honesty where what we say lines up with reality. So again, Ephesians 4:25. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbour, for you're all members of one body. So what's this all mean for us? A few things to tease out. I think firstly it means there's no such thing as a white lie, a blurring of a truth here or a selective retelling there that is acceptable. Now I guess I want to put a caveat around that. I'm not saying that there might not be a place for protecting the vulnerable, like children, and not giving them the whole story where there are things that could be damaging or harmful. I think that's different. That's not what I'm saying. But anything that's a distorting of reality, a covering over, a twisting, is really serious, and it hurts and damages. And despite what we think, it actually pushes others away. It creates distance in relationship rather than a bringing together. And one of the things that really stood out to me in the marriage counselling course that I did is that honesty in marriage is actually a key to intimacy. You see, it's the key as well to the church being one body, where we speak honestly and in love to one another because we're one, we belong together. And there's a sense in which the greater honesty that exists in our marriage, the greater place there is for vulnerability, the greater safety and trust that can be established. And this broader idea of honesty, it's not honesty for the sake of honesty, but it's honesty that serves love. So it's not blurting out every reaction that we have, because sometimes that can be harmful. But it's saying everything that we need to say that's truthful and honest for the sake of building another up. And that's part of growing together in Christ. I just wanted to close with two personal examples of where God's been working in Hayley and I in this area of honesty. Firstly, there was one night where we were sitting on the lounge, maybe a couple of months ago, sometime in lockdown actually, and sometimes we just finish our evenings together by one of us praying. And I turned to Hayley and said, would you like to pray tonight? And she was quite reluctant. And so I just asked, she said no. And I said, what's going on? I feel like you've got thoughts. I can see you're thinking something, but you're not telling them to me. I'd really like, I'd like you to be honest with me. I'd like to know what you're thinking. And so she did tell me. She told me some of the things that she was kind of fearful of, or just on her mind, on her heart. And some days later, she said, actually, asking me to be honest then, that was really helpful. And it did something helpful for our relationship in drawing us closer, in building understanding, in building trust, in helping us know one another. But another area was addressing workload with KCC recently. And just my kind of history is that I tend to get a bit passive aggressive because of that whole thing of wanting to keep others happy. I don't always say what I'm thinking. I hold back. And there's a period where the workload was just very intense, and it felt like I was being able to ask to do multiple things that together were all urgent, and you put the package together, it just felt impossible. And so I was kind of stewing a bit over this, but I hadn't said anything. And Hayley's like, you just need to be more honest with your manager. And she said, I'm sure she'll receive it well if you can think of a few constructive steps that you can put on the table as you're raising how this has impacted you. If you can put some constructive ideas for her, I'm sure she'll be receptive. And so I did, instead of being passive aggressive about it, instead of holding on to that anger and not kind of addressing the issues and having a frank conversation, I tried to have a constructive honesty, and that's been really helpful. There are just a couple of thoughts of where growing in this area has been helpful for Hayley and I, and perhaps they're helpful just to illustrate for you too. But I just want to close in prayer, and then I'll hand back to Danny. So please pray with me. Jesus, you are truth. You see reality as it really is.